Al Jazeera Podcasts.
Hey there, it's Malika. Just a note, we recorded this episode before the New York Police Department entered Columbia University's campus to arrest student protesters. We'll continue to watch the story closely and report more on it soon. Today on The Take, Columbia University continues its crackdown on student protests.
Overnight, campus protests escalating. Demonstrators occupying a building at Columbia University.
This has to be resolved.
We speak to one prominent Columbia graduate with some perspective on what's happening now. I'm Malika Bilal, and this is The Take. Protests in support of Palestine at college campuses across the United States continue to grow.
Tension spilling over at UCLA as protesters clash on campus.
Arrests were made on Emory University's campus.
UNC administrators say a pro-Palestinian encampment on campus has to start dispersing.
Many are drawing inspiration from the Gaza Solidarity encampment at Columbia University in New York. It's been going on for almost 2 weeks. In a minute, we'll speak to one well-known Columbia graduate who lives right down the street. But first, I'm talking to Ashish Malhotra, one of the producers here at The Take, who's been covering the story. Ashish, you have been at Columbia several times over the past 2 weeks. What happened on your last trip there?
Hey, Malika. So I was last there on Monday afternoon, and I went over because students had received word that if they didn't clear out by 2 p.m., they would risk suspension. But when I got inside the gates that day, I saw more activity than I'd seen before. Not only were students staying in the encampment, defying the deadline, but so many other students who hadn't necessarily been involved with the encampment this whole time were marching around campus as well, and they were doing so in solidarity and to guard against a potential sweep by authorities.
So did that work? Did the university move to clear the camp that afternoon?
So while I was there, it definitely seemed like it was working because they didn't clear the camp. And the students I spoke to around that time in the afternoon said that they hadn't received any word about any suspension. So there was a real sense of victory in the air, that the deadline had come and nothing had really happened. But around the same time, students heard from the university that it would not be divesting from Israel. And that was one of the key demands of the protesters. So negotiations had essentially broken down.
And then came nightfall. So I understand that a lot changed overnight, right?
Right. So later that night, after I left, the university did start handing out suspensions. And in response, students occupied Hamilton Hall, a university building that has a history of student takeovers. The protesters hung a banner outside one of the windows of the building, symbolically renaming it Hind's Hall, after Hind Rajab, a 6-year-old girl who was killed in Gaza earlier this year.
Hind and her relatives were killed attempting to flee Gaza City when their car encountered Israeli tanks.
Now, Malika, you and our listeners know that Hind's story is one that we've previously covered on The Take.
Right.
But what you might not know is that the hall that the students have now given her name to was once home to the office of the late Edward Said, the renowned Palestinian-American scholar who was also a professor at Columbia.
And today, I'm speaking to his wife, Mariam, a writer, activist, and graduate of Columbia, where she got her master's and her MBA in the 70s. I wanted to know about what she makes of the protest at the university and campuses across the United States.
My name is Mariam Said. I am the widow of the late Edward Said, who was a professor at Columbia, a renowned public intellectual and literary critic.
And where am I catching you today?
You're catching me at my home in New York City, a few blocks down the street from the campus where all the action in New York is happening.
So that means that you likely have seen some of that action, so I'm looking forward to asking you about that. There is so much to talk about, but you have a personal connection to this story. You are a graduate of Columbia University. And as you mentioned, Edward Said, professor, literary critic, was one of the foremost academics on Palestine, and he taught at Columbia for many years. He also pushed divestment from Israel in light of its treatment of Palestinians. So what are you thinking as you see these protests today?
Well, for me, it's a flash from the past. I remember in 1968, some of these protesters on the Columbia campus and how they were evicted and so on and so forth, and what they were demanding.
This is Columbia University in 1968. Here the protest was against the school's involvement in the machinery of war, against the traditional disregard for faculty and student opinion by a powerful administration.
All this flashes back to me, and this is very, very similar. And I am not surprised, because after the pandemic, this world has changed so much. The uprising and the change with this youth and young people is not surprising, but it is amazing how focused they are, how intelligent they are, and how organized they are. I am really impressed.
So I understand you went down to the protests on Monday. What did you see? What did you make of it?
I did go, and we walked around, and we talked to some of the people encamped there and some of the protesters. And they were full of energy and vigor and knew what they were doing. And it made me feel good that there are people in this world who are objecting to the atrocities that we see around us.
So for those who aren't as familiar with the work of your late husband, Edward Said, I want to play part of a speech that he gave in 2001. And this was at a protest. It's very similar to what we're seeing here at Columbia University.
You must, every one of us at this place here, must constantly remind somebody sitting next to them, somebody on the bus, somebody in school, somebody at the workplace. Ask them, where do they stand on the question of Palestine? Because everyone is involved. We, as Americans, are financing the repression of Palestinians by Israel.
So, keeping that in mind, fast forward to today, and there's a sign a protester held on Columbia's campus during these current protests that went viral online. It read, "Columbia, why require me to read Professor Edward Said if you don't want me to use it?" For you, Mariam, how does it feel to see these students referencing his work?
It is attesting to his influence, to his legacy, to how important his work and his words meant to a lot of people in this world. And 20 years after his death, he is remembered and still part of society in a way, because there are so many people who study him, who read him, who know who he was, a defender of his people, the Palestinians, and of justice and rights and self-determination for all.
Where would he have been if he were here with us today? Do you think he would be out there in the encampments?
Definitely. And probably he would have played a major role in being in negotiating with the protesters and the administration. And he may have had many insights that nobody has, because his vision of things was unique. And he always captured audiences. He had I don't know how to describe it, but he had a sensitivity where he could read people and can bring them together.
And then what about you? Because as we mentioned, you are also a graduate of Columbia. How do you see yourself involved in this current protest movement?
I am simply an alumni of the university. I really admire these young people for speaking up, for being courageous, for analyzing things for themselves. They have had a good education because when challenged, they rise to the occasion.
After the break, I asked Mariam about the connection between today's activists and those of 50 years ago. Well, Mariam, this week, the university refused to divest, which is the main ask or demand that protesters are making. What do you think of the university's response, that as well as the police presence and the heavily militarized response we've seen to protesters in breaking up the encampment? Is it similar to what you've seen over the decades?
Yes, but it is similar to what I have seen in the 60s and early 70s. But it is not similar to many, many protests that happened at the campus in those years between 1968 and now. The protests used to take place. There would be a group of people, sometimes a large, big group of people. When Edward was alive, they asked him to speak. He would speak to them. But they were not earth-shaking protests. They were protests. They were accepted. Some faculty members agreed with the students. They spoke up. Some did not. They were part of everyday life for the last 20 years from 68. But now it's a different story.
You know, we've seen your daughter. You have 2 children, and your daughter has been pictured at some of the protests.
My name is Najla Said. I'm the daughter of the late Professor Edward Said. And
what does it mean to you that your children, or at least one of your children, are involved and are making themselves and their views known on this issue?
No, both my children are involved, and both of them have made their views on this issue. My son was on Al Jazeera several times. He's a lawyer, and he works on law and Palestine. And my daughter, as you saw her on campus. She was with Mu'taz, the journalist, and she was encouraging them.
Not to be taking any attention away from the real issue, which is Gaza, but I just wanted to express on behalf of my family that this is amazing, and thank you. There was a photo yesterday of a young woman standing over there with the flag, and behind her you could see my dad's office window looking directly at it, and it was really, really moving. So thank you.
A lot of them were holding my father's book, The Question of Palestine, with their finger in it and the pages folded over. They're incredibly strong. They're very young.
And she was with them at this time.
Is that something that you all talk about over the dinner table or on a WhatsApp family chat?
We always discuss the question of Palestine. I was born to a family that my mother was very, very pro-Palestinian. We grew up with this issue from when we were kids. And then I married Edward, and for him it was the same thing. And Palestine and the question of Palestine, its history, etc., was part of our daily lives.
And it sounds like it still is.
Yeah, it is.
I wonder how it feels for you to know that you and generations of your family at this point have been fighting for Palestinian rights for so long. How do you look back on that? How do you reflect on that?
Well, it has been a very, very difficult struggle and complicated, painful, ongoing for a long time. And it must be a just solution. And if this is not achieved, this problem will continue.
Do you have hope that it will be achieved in the near future?
Well, I don't think it will be achieved in my life. That much I know. Because no matter what the resolution is now, it is going to take many, many years to implement it, to, define it, etc. But if in the end it's a just solution, then that is what really is required. It has to be just.
Mariam Said, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me and share your thoughts on this. I appreciate it.
Thank you for inviting me.
And that's The Take. This episode was produced by David Enders, Ashish Malhotra, and Sonia Bhagat, with Khalid Sultan, Negin Oliai, Sariyat Khalili, Amy Walters, Chloe Kaylee, Veronisa Campana, Zaina Badr, Manahil Naveed, Catherine Nouhan, Tamara Kandakar, and me, Malika Bilal. Our sound designer is Alex Roldan. Alexandra Locke is The Take's executive producer, and Ney Alvarez is Al Jazeera's head of audio. We'll be back.